Sergeant Elijah Loy is dead, but his most loyal partner, service dog Orion, can't accept reality. In a room filled with grief, the dog rushes toward the coffin, refusing to leave his master's side despite attempts to stop him. Stay tuned for the ending of this story, and don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. The silence in the chapel was oppressive, filling the air with an unbearable weight of loss. Somewhere in the corner, women were sobbing softly. Someone's handkerchief had fallen to the floor, but no one dared pick it up. White lilies placed along the aisle filled the space with a sweet aroma that mingled with the smell of varnished wood, wax, and cold stone. In the center of the room, beneath massive stained glass windows that reflected the muted light of an overcast day, rested a casket. The dark oak, polished to a mirror shine, seemed motionless, a reminder of a life that had once been filled with movement. A neatly folded flag lay on top. Red, white, blue, a symbol of honor, duty, and sacrifice. A symbol of the service Elijah Loy had chosen for himself, without hesitation, without fear. But neither this flag nor the strict guard of honor could soften his sister's pain. Margaret sat in the front pew, hunched over as if under an invisible weight. Her chestnut brown hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back into a messy bun, with a few strands escaping from its pin. Her slender fingers clutched a damp cloth, but her hands were shaking so badly that the fabric was on the verge of tearing. Her lips were dry, and her eyes, swollen with tears, darted from the coffin to the floor, as if trying to hide from the terrible reality. She still didn't believe it. Elijah had been through too much to just disappear like that. He was there, in the desert, in the scorching sands, in the night ambushes, in the desperate firefights where every step could be the last. He returned with the wounded, carried those who were never given a chance, saved, protected. He survived where others died. And now he is gone. The soldiers stood behind her. Stern faces, perfect posture, motionless figures. They did not allow themselves to show weakness. Their hands were clenched into fists, and their jaws were so tense that their cheekbones were white. They knew that something important was about to be said, but not a single word would fix what had happened. Standing at the side of the formation, right at the entrance to the chapel, stood Orion. His black and tan fur glinted in the candlelight, and his chest heaved with noticeable frequency. He was trained to handle stress, to handle sharp sounds, to be ordered to stand still in the most difficult moments. But now there was no command, no task, no voice that he was accustomed to listening to and obeying without thinking. The young officer held the leash tightly in his hands, but his grip was becoming weaker with each passing second. He felt the dog's muscles tense, his paws trembling from the restrained movement. Orion knew something was wrong. His dark eyes were fixed on the coffin. His ears rose and fell slightly, catching every movement, every breath in the room. He took a deep breath, sniffing the air, as if hoping to catch a familiar scent. But it was not that scent. He sucked in another breath, his eyes narrowing, his paws tensing. His partner was in front of him. The one who was always there. The one who told him when to attack, when to wait, when to defend, when to go forward no matter what. And now he was there, in the coffin, motionless, cold. Orion didn't understand. Why is no one doing anything? Why does no one give orders? Why is everyone standing and watching? He squealed quietly, but no one heard him. At that moment, the chaplain stepped forward and spoke. His voice was even, but there was something about it that sent shivers down your spine. We gather here today to honor the memory of Sergeant Elijah Loy, a warrior, a friend, a brother. Orion flinched. His ears twitched. His body tensed. The speaker's voice didn't matter. No one in the room mattered. There was only a coffin in front of him. And the man to whom he swore allegiance. The man he was supposed to serve. And he served. Always. So when his paws moved forward, he no longer heard the officer breathe out his name in panic. He didn't see Margaret turn around abruptly. He didn't feel the hands that were trying to hold him. He only knew one thing. He should have been there. The jolt was sharp, almost lightning fast. The officer's leash tightened, His fingers clenched convulsively, but the grip gave way. Orion lunged forward, his claws pounding loudly on the polished floor of the chapel, cutting through the silence with sharp blows. The soldiers flinched slightly, but no one moved. The officer, not expecting such an impulse, tried to grab the dog, but Orion was faster. His body, trained for lightning-fast attacks, coordinated maneuvers and instant reactions, moved silently and precisely. He rushed past the rows of seated people, not noticing the frightened glances, seized by only one goal. He didn't hear the muffled voices, didn't see the outstretched hands trying to stop him. At that moment, only the coffin existed for him, only the figure resting motionless in its dark depths. Margaret screamed, raising her head sharply, but before she could even take a breath, Orion made a leap. It was a moment frozen in time. The air was cut by a stifled gasp from the assembled crowd. The soldiers, accustomed to combat, to orders, to control, froze, unable to intervene. It seemed as if the room itself held its breath. There was a loud thud as Orion's paws landed on the polished wood. The coffin rocked slightly under his weight. For a split second it seemed as if Elijah would twitch, inhale, and rise as if after a night's watch. But nothing happened. Orion curled up on his soldier's chest and took pity on him. The dog was shaking. His dark eyes darted over Elijah's face, taking in familiar features. He leaned closer, gently nuzzling his cheek, his shoulder, his arm. The smell was right. But not quite. Cold. Still. Wrong. Orion sniffed again, shuddered, and let out a quiet, stifled sob. He didn't understand. His partner was always moving. Always responding. Always talking to him. Why isn't he talking now? The dog tried to wake him. Gently, with the tip of his nose, he nudged Elijah's palm. Once. Twice. 3 times. It was the familiar signal. Get up, it's time to go. Silence. Margaret pressed her palm to her lips, feeling her throat tighten painfully. Oh my God! A barely audible whisper escaped her lips. The soldier on the right made a move as if to approach, but one of the officers shook his head silently. Not now. Don't touch him now. Orion lowered his head, nuzzling Elijah's chest. His breathing was ragged, his ears twitching as if he was trying to catch something the others couldn't. Margaret watched, unable to tear herself away. He refused to leave. He couldn't believe it. Because it couldn't be true. The silence in the chapel became oppressive, almost visible. Even those who had been whispering a moment ago froze, not daring to interrupt what was happening. The air was thick with the smell of wax, lilies, and something else that could not be described in words, something that hung in the space, invisibly present among them. Orion did not move. His ears perked up, his breathing became ragged, and his gaze froze on one spot. He no longer sniffed, did not try to wake his master. Now he simply looked. It seemed that he saw something that was inaccessible to the human eye. Margaret took a cautious step forward, a strange premonition clenching her insides. Orion? She whispered. No reaction. Chaplain Reynolds, a man with a lined face, paled slightly. He looked from Orion to the space the dog was looking at, and then to Margaret. Sometimes, he said slowly, dogs see things we don't see. His voice, though even, sounded like a warning. Margaret swallowed but didn't look away. She felt a chill run down her spine, even though the chapel was warm. Some of the soldiers shifted nervously from one foot to the other. They were used to logic, to clear orders, to things that could be explained. But now no one knew what to do. Orion was still looking ahead. One of the soldiers couldn't take it anymore. What is he looking at? The voice was restrained, but there was a hint of fear in it. Margaret wanted to know that too. She stepped closer, now standing almost next to Orion, feeling the barely perceptible warmth coming from his tense body. And then something strange happened. She didn't see anything. But I felt it. There was something in the air, something that made her heart clench. Like the slightest movement that couldn't be there. Orion made a quiet, drawn-out sound, not a whine, not a growl, but something else. As if he was calling someone. At that moment, something inside Margaret broke. She wanted to look over her shoulder, but she didn't dare. It suddenly seemed to her that if she did this, if she allowed herself to believe for even a second what Orion believed, everything would change. But the dog already knew. He stopped waiting. Orion remained motionless, his gaze still fixed on the empty space next to the coffin. He did not blink, did not move, only his chest heaved in a ragged, confused rhythm. Margaret stood there, feeling a chill run down her spine. Her throat was dry, and the fingers she held on to the napkin were white with tension. No one in the room dared to say a word. Even the chaplain, who had just spoken of faith, remained silent, his gaze full of doubt. Orion took a deep breath. And suddenly something changed. Margaret felt it before she saw it. The tension in the dog eased. His ears twitched slightly, his tail dropped. He blinked, as if he had just woken from a long, deep sleep. The coffin he was guarding was still in front of him. But now he knew he must wait no longer. It was as if an inaudible farewell had been heard in the air. Orion whined softly, but it was not the desperate, demanding sound he had made when calling his master. It was something else, soft, humble, full of awareness. Margaret took another step forward. Orion! Her voice trembled, but she spoke anyway. It's okay. The dog turned its head, tearing its gaze away from the void for the first time. It was the moment when Margaret realized he was no longer searching. Chaplain Reynolds closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, then raised his head. There was firmness in his voice, but also gentleness. You are free, soldier. These words seemed to break invisible chains. Orion sighed, lowered his head, and closed his eyes. His body finally relaxed. He was still lying next to Elijah, but now it was not waiting, not trying to fix something. It was a farewell. The soldiers in the line exchanged brief glances. Someone wiped the corner of his eye, someone clenched his fists, but no one made a single unnecessary movement. Margaret crouched down, running her hand gently through Orion's fur. Good boy, she whispered. Orion didn't react right away, but after a moment he slowly raised his head and looked at her. He understood everything. And he was ready to leave. The doors creaked and a cold gust of wind blew into the chapel. Heavy and filled with dampness, it made the candles flicker and the white lilies standing by the coffin sway slightly. There was a feeling in the air, as if time itself had paused briefly. Margaret swallowed hard, unable to tear her eyes away from Orion. The dog sat across from her, his paws planted firmly on the floor, his back straight, but there was something elusive about his whole appearance. Not sadness, not pain, but something else. Something that could not be put into words. At this point, Chaplain Reynolds stepped forward and said quietly, The time has come. Margaret took a deep breath and, barely suppressing a shudder, looked at the coffin. 2 soldiers approached, lined up on either side, their movements precise, as if in battle. They carefully took hold of the lid, ready to close it, but at that moment Orion moved. He slowly walked up to the very edge of the coffin, lowered his head and gently placed his paw on the edge. No one dared to stop him. The soldiers, accustomed to discipline and restraint, suddenly felt something rising in their chests, like a suffocating, warm feeling that could neither be suppressed nor controlled. Someone exhaled heavily. Orion leaned down, touching his muzzle to Elijah's still hand, as if to make sure one last time that he was really there. He inhaled, paused, and then slowly removed his paw and stepped back. He said goodbye. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears stinging in the corners of her eyes. The lid of the coffin closed, and the sound of this movement, even so smooth, rushed through the chapel as if it split the air. When the coffin was carried outside, Orion walked alongside, never lagging behind. The ceremony continued in the cemetery. The gray marble of the monuments rose up among the withered grass, and the sky remained as heavy, leaden, as if unwilling to say goodbye to the one who rested beneath it. When the honorary salvo began, Orion did not flinch. When the bugler began to play, long and mournfully, he did not take his eyes off the freshly dug grave. And when the flag, folded into a triangle, was handed to Margaret, He took another step forward and looked straight ahead. For a second, Margaret thought he saw something again. Orion lifted his head higher, his tail twitched slightly, his ears perked up. He froze, and then suddenly turned slowly and looked into the void. She looked back too. There was nothing there. But something inside her pinched, and Margaret realized Orion was saying goodbye for a reason. He saw what she couldn't see. The one she lost was still there. For a second it seemed to her that the wind brought a quiet, almost inaudible voice. She couldn't make out the words, but suddenly she realized that they weren't for her. Orion blinked, took a deep breath, and then turned and moved forward. He didn't turn around again. Margaret, clutching the flag in her hands, followed him. Now they were moving forward. Together.